The Maxx. Image Comic presents The Maxx, written and illustrated by Sam Kieth and dialogue by William Messner Loebs. The illustration is very, very bright and colorful, and there's so many different styles that are incorporated, especially when there are, for example, a couple ads. They don't really go in the story, but they're there, and it's kind of fun to see different styles of the art, and the characters are shown in a very different way to show their individuality. For example, the Maxx, he's shown as this big character, purple and has big teeth, kind of comes across as like scary and daunting. But I found that the illustration that they chose to do for the Maxx is to kind of represent who he is and his struggles. For example, there's also Julie, this other character, who is very confident in herself, and she also has a difficult past, but they don't go a lot into that, but you can tell by the way she also responds to certain characters, because she's very very direct and kind of unhinged. For example, when she was talking to this client that she had, because she's a social worker, she kind of blew him off by saying that she has a job and he doesn't, and he like sleeps with a blanket that has vomit on it. So very unhinged, but I think she's also kind of funny. There's also the character, I think her name, she was introduced in the, like earlier in the comic. Right there, she was kind of the opening lady. She gave us a good example to kind of the dynamic of the story, on how it's not like your typical superhero story where there's an issue and then a hero comes swinging in and helps and saves the day. She was kind of like the damsel in distress, but instead of your typical superhero story, the Maxx came in, and instead he actually made things worse. And they were talking about how, like, in the beginning, they introduced this character right there. He actually comes back at the end, where it's him talking to the Maxx, and he basically reminds him and was like, you have no recollection of what actually happened. You don't know that you actually are just as bad as I am. And the Maxx starts struggling, and he suddenly starts remembering, but he doesn't have time to fix things or change things. Instead, he just remembers, and this is the first issue, so we don't know what happens after. So it's kind of like a cliffhanger, which I thought was also interesting. And around near the middle, there was a scene where there's these two characters. They are at, I'm pretty sure it's a laundromat, and they're just drawing jackets and whatnot. And this girl, there's a theme where the girls are the ones who are in trouble, and the Maxx is always the one who's there, and he comes and he kind of like sends trouble towards them instead of away from them, because when he found out about each of the women who were there, because he was in jail but he got bailed out, instead of making things better, this guy from earlier actually shows up at the laundromat. This guy shows up at the laundromat, and he kills the girl. Kills her. And she also had gotten a weapon for herself because she was being like, she was warned that it was dangerous and nobody was taking her seriously. But she ended up getting hurt. And that was kind of a theme going on with all the women. They were just in danger, and it was really interesting to me how there wasn't a, like, it wasn't your typical, like, okay, happy ending, everything's okay. Instead, it just started off showing, you know, people struggling and needing help, and some bad guys, like these characters up here. And it just ended with a cliffhanger and not on a good note, which I found really interesting. As for the writing, it was very clear, and I thought it was very fun how I can really understand everybody's personality through the writing. And it wasn't like, it had a lot of slang in it. Each word, like, there were so many times that, like, instead of saying do you know, they'd say do you know, with like it'd be written like that. And I just found that really interesting because it was so informal that it was very fun to read. There was definitely, at least I could say, a part at the end that I thought was a little bit confusing just because of the style of writing. When it comes to, like I said, it's very personalized, so I can tell who each character is through the writing. When it came to this guy, his writing was very, like, customized, I could say. Like, the letters were upside down, some were smaller than others, and I thought that was interesting, but it made it a little bit difficult to understand, because they would, for example, the letter I, it would actually be an exclamation mark. The O's would be really, really small. The A's were underlined. But I found that interesting, though, because it was very personalized. And I also found that the way the characters are illustrated was just, it was so interesting to see. Because even with the bad guys over here, especially this one, he's shown as very, like, small and, like, in need of help, but he's the bad guy, so why is he represented as small? But I think it's just interesting because the artist, Sam Kieth, his choice in designing each character, it's very intentional, and you can see that. Because, for example, that evil guy right here, he is shown as small because he's actually doing the wrong thing, and I can tell that he doesn't really want to do that because he's just there for money, and he just wants to get by, and his partner is shown as really big and strong, quite literally the opposite of him. And he's the one who's very violent and happens to kill some of the victims sometimes, but they're just doing it to take their money. And the women are always shown as, like, fragile but very beautiful and just kind of like damsel in distress. And I just really, really thought that the writing and just everything in this issue was really well done. And it really gets you to want to read the next one because you're left on a cliffhanger wondering what happens next.